Salam, Namaste, Sat Sri Akal, for all my South Asian friends. Hope everyone is doing well. I'm very honored to be a part of this platform and to be a part of this community and this discussion. So thank you, Ahmad and Vilia, for inviting me today. This was a beautiful Kathak dance performance video that we just saw. And it was, of course, called a Tarana, which is, like Ahmad, you rightly said, a contribution of Amir Khosrow, who was a Muslim Sufi saint and a poet, and is also predominantly known as the father of Hindustani classical music in some ways. So today's discussion is somehow connected to that. The Tarana, in fact, in case you guys were listening to some of the words that were being said in that particular song, things like Yalali Yalali is called a Tarana. And it's actually like a mixture of Arabic and Persian syllables. And that is honestly the contribution that a lot of Muslims have made to the North Indian classical music tradition. So today's discussion is going to be a discussion on Sufi mystics and Hindustani classical music. What was their contribution and relationship with this type of music? And of course, this video sets the tone. Who were these people? And importantly, how was this made possible? And if I get a chance, I will try to also sing some examples of the type of contributions that were being made to show this interesting confluence between the Islamic Persian tradition and the Sanskrit tradition, which beautifully created the Hindustani classical music of this region. Why I chose this, it's important to sort of mention that this particular topic is because I've been training in classical music for the last 4 years now. And my teacher, Rauf Sami, who is the son of Ustad Nasiruddin Sami, who's a legendary khayal expert and of the subcontinent. He's also of the Delhi Gharana. Also a descendant of Tanris Khan, who was a court musician during the time of Bahadur Shah Zafar. Interestingly, also the same family seems to carry or is known to carry the traditions of Amir Khosrow and the Qawwali tradition that Amir Khosrow also contributed to North Indian classical music. And this particular family, under which I train with, is called the Qawwal Bacche. And they all seem to be situated in Pakistan, in Karachi. Of course, some state that they've also stayed back in Delhi because that's where Amir Khosrow is also buried. But why I was interested in the sort of Islamic side of Hindustani classical music was because when I started training, I was interested to see that there were two seemingly similar strands of music, khayal, which predominantly is North Indian classical music, and Qawwali, which is considered a semi-classical music, both kind of divided across the border. So when you look at the music of Pakistan, and when people say, what is the music of Pakistan? A lot of people talk about the music of Qawwali. When you talk about the other side of the border, which is, India, people often talk about North Indian classical music to be associated with the khayal, with the drupad, with the tarana. So somehow, we somehow differentiated or divided these forms of music, which actually are stemming from the same source, which also made me question this complicated topic of what is like the Pakistani culture and identity. And, Dastaangoi is all about sort of creating awareness about that. But I would also like to put this sort of question to all of you that I don't think that there could be a way to define what is necessarily Pakistani, in the same way that there might not necessarily be a way to define what is Indian, because there's been such a shared landscape, cultural heritage and literary tradition of both religions also, and of a lot of other religions as well. So this is one of the reasons why I was interested in this particular topic. My intention again with this talk today is to kind of show the complicated but really rich and old ancient history of South Asia that cannot always be divided along religious lines either. My tilt towards the Islamic tradition in North Indian classical music is primarily because I come from a Muslim background, and for me, it was interesting to see that my ustad and my teachers were all singing a lot of these musical traditions that were revering gods that belong to a lot of gods that are part of Hinduism, for instance. And they didn't necessarily see a disconnect with them being Muslim and being able to perform this sort of music. So for me, I think my intention again is to kind of talk about how we're not always restricted by countries and by borders, and that we share so much across the border, and in fact across the entire region and across the whether it is the Persian tradition that South Asia has incorporated, whether it's the Sanskrit tradition, whether it is a lot that we borrowed from Central Asia, the Turkics that were also have ruled over this region. And so my intention has been to bridge a lot of these boxes that we've kind of divided, and how my ustad often says that South Asia is like this beautiful guldasta, which is kind of like a bouquet of all these different flowers and these mix of beautiful smells that you have, which is what makes us very unique and interesting. So I share all of these interesting stories today. Though I have studied a lot of these texts, a lot of academics texts, and I have done research on this particular topic about the contribution of Muslims on North Indian classical music, I would like to kind of caveat it by saying that I'm not a scholar by profession. I'm not a historian. But I'm happy to share a list of references, and these are all sort of, verified to the best, of course, collected through oral histories as well, but through scholars that have actually contributed and have actually studied North Indian classical music and its history. So I'm happy to also share a list of references, and I'm happy to receive feedback on this and explore and talk about this with whoever would like to afterwards. I will try to explain some of these concepts that we'll talk about to the best of my ability, assuming that people don't have a very extensive knowledge on the topic. So I'll assume that everyone has a little awareness or knowledge on this topic. So apologies if people already are familiar with this, or if I end up repeating myself. Again, I would also like to add that history is a very interesting subject, depends on which side of history you're on. And history is, of course, always written by those that have dominated, that have been in power. So I think as citizens of the global world, citizens that share so much in common with this region, I think it's our duty to kind of investigate and see, what are the different types of histories out there, because certainly there is a lot of intolerance. There's a lot of good things, of course, but there's also a lot of towards this kind of narrative, and in the mainstream media, or what we see, what countries, what states, and what governments do is not necessarily promotes this kind of alternative history, as I'd call it, either at the educational level or in the media. So moving on to Sufi mystics in North India, I'd like to first talk a little bit about Sufism here, for those that don't know. So Sufism, which is also known as tasawwuf in the Muslim world, is a particular sort of esoteric, mystical philosophy within the Islamic tradition. Broadly speaking, those that practice this philosophy are usually connected to a Sufi order, which is formed around a spiritual guide or a teacher, and the primary intention of it being to achieve a closeness to Allah, to God. This doesn't necessarily, it's sort of an inward practice of spirituality rather than a strict sort of legalistic interpretation of Islam. But this doesn't mean that Sufis are necessarily not conservative in their practice of Islamic faith or values. So there are different Sufi orders that have different approaches to this, and Sufi orders of North India or of the subcontinent includes the Chishtiyas, the Sohrawardis, the Qadris, the Naqshbandis, etc. And they've dominated this landscape for many, many centuries. So when I use the term mystics or Sufis, please just bear in mind that it is kind of being used interchangeably with being Muslim, and Sufis are not necessarily outside of Islam, which is sometimes often the case that can be portrayed in mainstream media as if some sort of alternative religion necessarily. It's also become a sort of fashionable thing, to kind of distance in the West, or sometimes even I guess here, to kind of distance yourself with more conservative Muslims. And so it's kind of easier to say Sufis, but I just like to say that, Sufism is very much part of Islam. Sufis have played an instrumental role in South Asian history and subsequently its music as well. Many Sufis came and settled from other parts of the Islamic world, particularly from the Persianate Empire, which includes present-day Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. A lot of them were escaping the Mongol raids as well. And so ultimately, over generations, many assimilated into the Indian culture. And in fact, Amir Khosrow is a classic example of that assimilation, because Amir Khosrow was his father was actually Turkic, his mother was Indian, native to India, and he was born in India. And in fact, at the time, Delhi was quite a capital for a lot of these Muslims or Sufis that were fleeing the Mongol raids. And it was really like a capital for a lot of the immigrants. And it was, Muslims were received very, very openly. And Amir Khosrow has also written about it. So that's a beautiful, I think, fact about Delhi as well. So there are two well-known names that come to mind when one talks about the history of North Indian classical music. Of course, one of the most prominent ones being Amir Khosrow, as I mentioned, who himself was a poet, a mystic, a Muslim, and both the khayal and the tarana, which we just heard, which forms one of the main sort of features of North Indian classical music, are attributed to him. Of course, there's contentious debate about it, but generally it is believed that the khayal was contributed or was a result of this interaction with Sufi mystics. Qawwali is also attributed to him, even though it's considered to be part of semi-classical music. Which is why at one point in history, qawwals were known to be the original exponents of the khayal, and they usually would perform at dargahs. And in that same strain, I'm very blessed and lucky to have been training by those specific qawwals that have been the disciples of the students of Amir Khosrow. Another central figure to Hindustani classical music that we hear is Sansan. Mia Tansen, as I should say. And everyone has heard of Mia Tansen, who was Akbar's court musician in the 16th century. Akbar gave him the title of Mia, and he's known to have invented many, many rags, particularly the ones with Mia in them. So if you hear of rag Mia Ki Tori, rag Mia Ki Malhar, they're normally attributed to Tansen. most contemporary Hindustani musical gharanas trace their lineages back to Tansen. So this is how an important role he plays in the evolution of this sort of music. But today I'm talking about a interesting, slight different but related character who supports this narrative of this shared history in the context of contribution of Sufis. So Tansen is known to have been taught by a Hindu mystic saint called Swami Haridas, which is predominantly what we hear and what we know of. But interestingly, Tansen also had another musical and spiritual teacher, both musical and spiritual teacher, who was a Sufi mystic called Muhammad Ghaus. Now, Muhammad Ghaus Gwaliori, his name was Gwaliori because he was from the city of Gwalior. So he was again living in Gwalior. Belonged to the Shatari Sufi order, also which was quite popular at the time, and had a good relation with the royal courts. And so the Sufis also interestingly shared an interesting relationship with the state, and were patronized by the state and with the Mughal courts at that time. It was an interesting, complicated relationship because the Mughal courts needed a lot of the Sufis sort of buy-in because they had a lot of support with the masses of that time. And so Mughals usually had to, or the Muslims or other rulers had to kind of have the Sufis by their side. But interestingly, Tansen was, Muhammad Ghaus was the one who actually sent Tansen off to learn further music to Swami Haridas for further musical training. And of course, there are different versions of history in this, but Muhammad Ghaus is definitely a very, very central character and a feature in Tansen's life, even though we might not hear much about it. So much so that Tansen is actually buried in the complex of Muhammad Ghaus's tomb in Gwalior in India. And a lot of gharanas, like I said, trace their lineage back to Tansen. And so one of the predominant gharanas are also called the Gwalior Gharana in Hindustani music. So Muhammad Ghaus was, again, like Amir Khosrow, a spiritual teacher, a mystic, an intellectual. And he was also known to have been Humayun, who is Akbar's, Mughal Emperor Akbar's teacher. Ghaus, interestingly, I also came across during my research. Obviously, being part of Sufis, they wrote a lot about the kind of Sufi practices and the kind of intellectual religious discourse that was predominantly kind of spread in that time or talked about in that time. So Ghaus interestingly translated this Sanskrit text to Persian, and the Sanskrit text called Amarta Kunda, which means the pool of nectar. And what was interesting about this particular text is, and again, Sufis at that time would choose a lot of these Sanskrit texts more for their philosophical interest, less for their religious practice. But Ghaus translates this Sanskrit text and primarily draws on a lot of similarities between certain yogic practices and Sufi concepts, and in fact integrates a lot of yogic practices on sound into sound, which is such as mantras and chants, into Sufi practices of zikr. Now, for those, again, that don't necessarily know, zikr is an Islamic devotional practice that is based on reciting certain prayers or names of God or names of Allah. And the purpose of zikr is to actually achieve a spiritual closeness to God. And I thought that these two interesting pieces of information about Muhammad Ghaus, one, that he was the music teacher of, being a Muslim, a music teacher of Sansan, and secondly, that he was translating a lot of and integrating a lot of these yogic practices on sound into Sufic practices. This is not to say that zikr did not exist before that. They were always, of course, there, but he borrowed things that he thought would actually contribute to achieving that kind of spiritual realization and closeness to God. So I thought that this becomes really interesting because it tells us something that we otherwise don't hear about, which is this commonality about the power of sound or the power of sur, which is common to both the Islamic tradition and to Hindustani classical music, and the importance of sound itself. Usually we hear about usually we hear about Qawwali as being like the focus of devotional music, because it uses a lot of words and poetry, and Qawwali is usually referred to as Ilmul Kalam for that reason. But for me, it was interesting because we're talking about a very particular understanding of sound, which is shared with Hindustani classical music, that sound itself has the fundamental feature and the fundamental properties to actually influence and affect someone, move someone deeply, and to achieve that kind of spiritual transcendence. So the fact that sound is considered fundamentally sacred, to be able to transport one's physical body. And so sound, when you talk about sound, it is not something that you just are hearing, but it's actually impacting your entire sort of body. If you look at its shared properties with Hindustani classical music, I thought that was interesting because it triggers those same feelings of devotion when you listen to the khayal, for instance, which is also primarily focused on sound and the sur, and the illustration of these notes through the voice. So the voice is, and just sound itself without even words, plays such a crucial role in both these sort of traditions of Islam. In the Islamic tradition, and a lot of Muslim musicians use this example when it is often said that music is forbidden in the Islamic tradition, that the creation of the universe itself is centered on the characteristic of sound. So God said kun, which means be, and the world was created. And so the world, in a sense, is created on this concept of sound. If you look at sound in a different way, for Muslims interact with scripture primarily based on sound. And the Quran, for instance, was revealed not in writing, it was transmitted orally to the Prophet through a voice. The voice is, again, a primary feature of Hindustani classical music. It is communicated through the voice, and instruments are used to accompany it. Classical music, if you talk about other sort of shared similarities between it, is also bound by certain musical principles, such as a rag. Now, the rag is a certain melodic scale in which there is a certain pattern of notes. The reason for that is, again, that these rags have actually a specific tasir, which means an effect or an asar. And that's why each of these rags are intended to elicit a very specific emotion in its listener. Again, coming back to the impact and inherent power that sound has. Similarly, an Arabic equivalent of rag, Persians have this too, but in the Arabic traditional music, it is called a maqam, which is a similar equivalent to rags, which forms the basis of Arabic classical music. And it also, maqam also is a very Sufic term, which means station. And station in terms of the levels of closeness that you reach to God. Interestingly, also, the use of 7 notes in music, and Mohammad Ghaus was also, during its translation, writing about this, is the 7 notes in music in Indic, in the Indian tradition, is associated with 7 chakras as the spinal nerve centers in the body. And interestingly, Horse's commentary is similar on the Islamic sort of organization of the body, that sound is not simply heard but experienced in the body, and that it actually has impact on different nerve centers. And so there are like a lot of these parallels that I began to see in my while doing a lot of my practice as well. At the same time, Hindustani classical music is not like ambient music. I was actually comparing it to this genre of ambient music, which can kind of play in the background, and you can continue to kind of do whatever you want. So Hindustani classical music is actually performed for an audience that listens intently, and it is able to elicit a specific emotion, provided that the performer is actually able to create that kind of intended effect on the listener. This tradition of deep listening in Hindustani classical music is both also again in the Islamic tradition, which is tied to the concept of samat, and hence the sama, which is also a spiritual devotional practice of listening intently in Islamic traditions. And so in English, we would translate samat as hearing, but what samat actually means is hearing with a deep awareness, or listening very intently and deeply. And this is exactly the kind of etiquette that you give to Hindustani classical music. So in this sense, it is of no surprise to me also that even though whoever tries to write the side of history, Pakistan does the same, and across the border, India does the same to try and kind of own who created this sort of these musical genres. But when you look into the history of Khayal or the Tirana, it seems to suggest that it could be an invention, or it is an invention of the Muslims, because it was performed at the Mughal courts, used for specific healing purposes, because it shares a lot of the similar understanding about sound itself. Gee, sorry, have I gone over time?
A little bit.
Okay, so I think this is I could probably go on, and I think this pretty much covers the kind of intersection that I wanted to show between Sufi mystics and their relationship, their contribution, their influence on Hindustani classical music. Of course, there's a lot of stuff to talk about within this.
Actually, what I said when I introduced you, this is something that even yesterday when we were on the phone, I was like, we're going to need to have a longer conversation. But I would request for you, Wajiha, is if you could showcase an example with the teachings that you've been taking.
So, I'll just sing for you guys, sing or recite for you guys a hamd in Rag Bhairav. And Rag Bhairav, interestingly, is also associated with Lord Shiva, who's assumed to be, or is sort of the supreme deity in Hinduism. Rag Bhairav is a rag which is associated with devotion and prayer, and it is usually sung really early in the morning. So the mood of it, and like I said, each rag is intended to create a certain mood. And so the poetry associated, the words associated with it are also reflective of that mood. So I'm going to sing a hamd, which is again a praise of Allah in Rag Bhairav. So I'll just illustrate a bit of that. Sorry, I'm just going to put on my electronic tanpura.
This has all been so amazing to kind of hear, and the way that
sorry guys, I think, yeah. So again, because of lack of time, I will have to end it there because with classical music, you have to kind of